This is TWiT.
Pick of the week.
And I really enjoy doing shows with Micah. I'm glad you're back, Leo. And I'm sorry. I did one last week that I felt a little bit bad about. Actually, I didn't really feel that bad about it. It was a bad whiskey story. Like it sent me down a path and I got a little angry and I needed to solve. I needed to feel better. And my Danish friend Casper pinged me privately, who's also a listener to the show, about a Danish whiskey that he wanted me to try. And we were talking about that. And so I started digging into Danish whiskey and fell into a story that's everything good about whiskey. Because the story that I told last week about Maclo was everything bad about whiskey. The ultimate commercialization without a care for the product. Like it was dreadful. But it's weird because you don't think about Danish whiskey. Like, why would you? It's just so odd. And the point is that the Danes haven't got a big history around whiskey because they didn't get into it till just very recently. Now, part of this has to do with older Scandinavian culture, where, of course, they were all farmers. You know, we talk about the Vikings being these, marauders, but they were farmers first. They just, got good at it and needed more land and went and acquired it by force. And so they were actually really strict about alcohol, and to the point where coming into the modern era, alcohol was so restrictive in Scandinavian countries across the board, it's relatively rare. But when Denmark joined the ECCs, or the EEC, this is what became the EU, alongside that was a change in regulations and taxation for things like alcohol. So they aligned their regulation and taxation to the EU standard. And that just opened the door to the possibility of manufacturing alcohol and having it reasonably priced. And that happened. So around 2005, there was a group of fellows, 9 of them actually, Danish fellows, in a little town called Stauning. And I'm probably mispronouncing it in the Danish. They got shapes to their words that are hard for my Canadian mouth to spit out. Actually, they were in a butcher shop. One of them was a butcher. There's a doctor and an interesting set of characters, a bunch of engineers. But they started tinkering with making whiskey. They had a local barley farm. They even got some local peat. And they used part of the butcher shop to dry and malt the barley and made a small batch. They bought a couple of small alembic stills. These are the old style pre-pot still designs. They were Spanish. And they were able to make a few hundred liters of a small bottling. But they sent one of the sample bottles to Jim Murray. And Jim Murray is one of the gods of whiskey. He writes the Whiskey Bible and so forth. The quote from Jim Murray, which they're apparently now allowed to use, but it's literally what he said to them, was, "What on earth is this? Whiskey lovers would kill their mothers for a bottle of this.
Wow.
This could possibly be some of the world's best peated whiskey." From a group of guys in a butcher shop in a little town in Denmark. So with Jim Murray telling them they've got a good idea, they were able to put together enough money to build the distillery just south of Stauning, which happens to be essentially the same latitude as Edinburgh in Scotland. Like there's a lot more to do. That part of the world is more like the Highlands of Scotland than a lot of other places. By the ocean, it faces into the North Sea. So they converted an old farm into a small distillery and switched some buildings over to do floor maltings, very old school, not the modern malting techniques. Built a drying kiln using peat and sometimes not. They bought a couple more Spanish pot stills that they directly heated them. They didn't use steam. They kept the system simple. By 2009, they were sort of assembled and starting to produce. They built a fizzer to space right off the bat. Like you could watch us make our stuff. That was always their way. And they were everything local, everything as local as it could be. They got smitten with rye. So they started buying local rye and malting it, which is very unusual. Most rye is just direct ground. And we usually see rye in American bourbons, but they were malting rye, which is hard to do, but they were using a floor method. It doesn't go as well in drum methods for malting. So they got their first bottlings done in 2012, and you've not heard of them for a simple reason. They sold everything. They could not make enough. How well did they do? Their production was somewhere around 80,000 liters by 2013. but it was all instantly sold out. All of them, the top tier restaurants in Scandinavia, put it on the shelves. Noma, arguably the best restaurant in the world, had it on the shelf. Like this was very good, very rare whiskey. And around then, Diageo showed up.
Oh no! Don't tell me no.
Well, that's not what happened. Diageo did not buy them up. Diageo made an investment in them. They refused to sell, but they said they did need some money and they could use the help. And so Diageo did buy into, as I've read the various bits and pieces around this idea that what these guys were doing was super old school whiskey, older school than the Scots were doing at that time, because they weren't trying to do the volume. So they bought 25% of Stauning. Which gave them a substantial amount of funding. So they had the money to build out a larger distillery next door to the original farm. But they refused to use bigger stills. They started out with small stills. So instead of having a handful of big stills, they bought 24 pot stills from the Scottish manufacturers. It's just a ton of these little stills. They thought that floor malting was incredibly important, so they custom built their own automated floor malting system. So automatic turning and watering of both barley and rye. They not as efficient as the modern drum techniques, but they're sticking with their methods. They did the same for the rye. They didn't have the big cypress barrels to do mash in the old farm. So what they'd actually done is they kind of converted this washing machine into a rotary mash tun that would do extraction for them. They run it through multiple times. So they had a totally unique mashing approach, and they just scaled it in the new distillery. So they mash unlike anybody else in the world. All those 24 pot stills, all still direct fired, which is dangerous. But they have come to appreciate that the direct fire makes the base of the still so much hotter to get the distillate to actually start to evaporate, that it toasts some of the residues, which introduces a set of cereal flavors that they don't think they can get anywhere else. So it's old school, but it creates this other flavor to it. They do a double distillation, which is very traditional Scottish wash and spirit still distillation. They use a pallet rack house, which I think would be the most modern thing that they do, where they are stacking the barrels upright on pallets high in their rack buildings rather than laying them on their sides. So their aging behavior is a little bit different. But that's all they had at the time, and they refused to change their methods. They're sticking with this style. They prefer American oak, both virgin, like unused, which they typically put the rye into, and the bourbon. And they also use bourbon casks, which are common and popular and effective. Which they do a lot of aging with, but they also experiment with barrels all the time. So if you can get your hands on any of it, they've got wine finishes and tequila finishes, sherry finishes, you name it. So their primary production whiskey, what they make most of the time, are basically four versions: both a peated and non-peated malted rye and a peated and non-peated malted barley. But then they play with the bottlings. So the whiskey I'm going to recommend today, which you can find, it is available in the U.S. Flavor U.S. Website had it for about $85, is the Stauning KAOS Danish whiskey. So this is arguably their most popular, most award-winning. They blend together their single malt and their peated single malt and the malted rye. So it's all from the same distillery. One would argue you could call it a single malt.
So is it? There's a hardcore edition and a regular edition. One's cask strength or
more peat?
More peat. If you like your peat, go with the hardcore.
It's Danish peat, right? Like it is. This is not peat from Islay. Bottled at 46, which is your traditional, normal clear bottling level. But just the most honest manifestation of whiskey I've seen in a long, long time. Wow. So I haven't had a chance to tour this place yet, but I'm going to be in Copenhagen later this summer. So I'm going to see if I can add a day or two and get down there and take a walk around. And but it's inspired a Danish whiskey industry that is very much based on this attitude of terroir, of making your whiskey from the things in your area, which is very Danish. And it's turned into a successful industry. So Stauning may have been the first, but they are not the only that's happening in Denmark today.
Stauning KAOS. KAOS. Yeah. Or if you really like your peat, get some hardcore.
Yeah, you'll find them mostly in Denmark. They're hard to come by otherwise, but there are a few that are brought to the U.S. So grab what you can. But the KAOS is the one you most like.
Their website, like many whiskey maker websites, has some terrific cocktail recipes.
Yes,
by the way.
it does.
So if you can't find this, I was just looking through. I might do their little variation on the Manhattan. Looks pretty good.
Yeah, there you go.
You could just drop the peat into it, and then you'd have all the peat.
I'm going to forego the peat, but that's just personal preference.